her husband's death, she began serving as a member of the American delegation for the UN General Assembly, where she played an essential role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We meet her in 1950 when John F. Kennedy is in the House of Representatives. Let's hear her story, so let's welcome Mrs. Roosevelt.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be speaking to you today on this 30th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. 30 years ago, women were given the right to vote. Now, everywhere people are asking, what have women done with the vote? I often wonder why people don't ask men the same thing, what they've done with the vote for the last 150 years. But I'd like to take a few minutes this morning to think about women as citizens. Think about where we've come in the last 30 years, what we're doing now, and perhaps dream a little bit about what we might look for in the future. Now, when the women were wanting the vote, they called themselves suffragists. And when I was little, I didn't understand that word at all. It doesn't have anything to do with suffering, but suffrage means to have the right to vote. And so they wanted to stand up for this, for women everywhere that didn't have a chance. As citizens, well, I am a citizen. Everyone in this room here, you're a citizen of the United States if you were born here in the United States. Or perhaps you're a naturalized citizen if you were born in another country. But in 1884, when I was born in New York, I was a citizen. And ever since, we've heard from John Adams and from James Madison, from the very beginning of our country, the women were considered citizens. We were counted in the census, but we were not allowed to vote. I will say, I don't believe this was done out of any particular malice. I think we need to remember that the men were simply doing what had been done all along from the countries where their heritage came from. Women did not have power there, so they did not think to give it to us here. Change happens very gradually. And it takes people who can imagine things the way they aren't already. If that seems odd to you, think 100 years ago in 1850, if you'd walked down the street and told people, well, someday we're going to be driving ourselves around in little metal boxes, they would have thought that you were a very silly person. That would have been entirely outside of the imagination of the average person. It took someone with vision and people working on it over a great deal of time to change the way we do things. I was not a suffragist. As a little girl, I was surrounded by people who believed that government and politics are entirely the purview of men. Even from my mother. I mean, it wasn't only the men who said this, the women expected it too. My mother grew up as part of New York society, spelled with a capital S, in which beauty was a woman's greatest asset. In that society, well, you didn't need to brag about money because the people around you had money. You didn't need to find a job because you were going to marry someone in one of these families. But beauty, now, that was an asset money couldn't buy. And so it was prized above all else. And my mother was beautiful. Unfortunately, when I came on a few years later, I think she was quite disappointed in a child whose looks fell so far below the family standard. I remember her saying to me, "You haven't got looks, so you'd better have manners." But even manners can be confusing for a child. I remember one summer, I was given a ride on a donkey. Our family was traveling in Italy, and I was given a ride on a donkey, and I noticed that my donkey boy's feet were cut and bleeding. Well, I've always had a great concern for the suffering of other people, even as a little child. And by the time we got back from the ride, the boy was on the donkey and I was running alongside. But Mother was not pleased. There was one thing I could do for my mother. When she would have one of her terrible headaches, she would have me rub her forehead over and over and over again. And ever since, I've had an undying desire to be useful. I can't be pretty, which I never will. Perhaps I can be useful. But still, being useful doesn't mean they're going to have anything to do with government or politics, and I didn't think I would. I had one good example, though, my Auntie Bai. This is my Uncle Theodore Roosevelt's older sister. Mrs. William Sheffield Coles was her full name, but I was staying with my aunt in Washington, D.C. for a while during the time my uncle was president. And on more than one occasion, I saw him come over and talk with his older sister about matters in the government, and it was very clear he wanted her opinion. But you have to understand, in my family, Auntie Bai was always said to have a man's mind. This was a great compliment. It was often said that if she had been a man, she would have been president. But this was always said as if she were the great exception among women. So it wasn't anything any of us might think about. I suppose that I came to the idea of suffrage rather late. It was when my husband, in 1911, he declared he was for women's suffrage. Then I thought, well, if he is, then I must be too. So I wasn't one of those brave women who are out marching with the signs. And you can read elsewhere in the museum here a great deal about the many battles women went through to bring us the right to vote. But in 1920, 30 years ago, this came to pass. I was very lucky. I felt myself lucky coming in only in 1911 to have met Miss Anna Howard Shaw, who said that the only way you can claim that we have a democracy and that women can't vote is to prove that women are not people. I also have a good friendship with Carrie Chapman Catt, or had until her death just 3 years ago, and came to admire her strength in bringing the women's vote and women's rights to all people. But they said, when we got the vote, that either the economy would be ruined and the world would fall apart, or that once women had the vote, war and suffering would cease. Well, neither the dire exceptions nor the rosy ones have come to pass. But what has happened in the last 30 years? Well, think back first to 1920. It was only in August that the amendment was ratified. There were very few months before the election in November, and only about a third of the women who were eligible to vote in that election actually did, because there wasn't much time. And many women didn't even think it was appropriate for themselves to vote. These changes came very gradually. But I'd like to tell you a story of something that happened in 1924. A troublesome story, really, because the road has been rocky along the way. By 1924, we'd done more work getting women registered to vote, at least. And the Democratic Party, with great fanfare, announced that they would be the first political group to seek out women's opinions on certain questions so that they might become part of the platform, the democratic platform that would be presented across the country for the campaign. They invited me to chair this committee of women, and I brought together experts from various places around the country. For 3 months we labored to come up with what we felt the Democratic Party should address. We gave support for the League of Nations, for this international body to help broker world peace. We spoke out for a 48-hour work day, for equal pay for women workers, for a ratification of the child labor amendment, for a bureau to see to the health and safety of the living where we live and make our lives, that the health and safety of where we live are very important, and that for a minimum wage, and that wages be commensurate with the cost of living and health expenses. Well, we wrote all of this up, and we arrived in Madison Square Garden. Do you remember how hot it was? There wasn't a single day less than 90 degrees, and some of them broke 100 in late June and early July. And the men would not allow us inside. The resolutions committee did not allow us to come inside to present these planks for the democratic platform. Well, I and a couple of the others sat outside the door all night long. They voted 3 times. The last vote was 18 for and 22 against admitting us or even our papers into the room. I finally slid them under the door, but I don't know that anyone ever read them. Now, I suppose in asking us, the Democratic Party did more than our opponents, but by not listening to us, well, it's no wonder to me that we lost the election that year to Calvin Coolidge. But I did not begin to even be interested in politics. I was very involved throughout the 1920s. But it did not occur to me until after we had the vote. Why, back in 1905, my first inspiration to become interested at all happened when Franklin and I were on our honeymoon. You must understand, this is 15 years before the women have the vote and 6 years before I even think about suffrage at all. But in 1905, I was only 20 years old, and I was quite struck by the degree to which other women at the dinner table participated in the political discussions. This was entirely outside my experience. I was quite dumbfounded by it, and of course I sat silent. The next day, we were visiting Sir Ronald Ferguson and his wife, Lady Helen, and Sir Ronald and Franklin went off to climb some nearby peak. And I was alone at tea with Lady Helen when she asked me a devastating question. "Do tell, my dear," she asked, "how is it that you explain the difference between your national and state governments? To us it seems so confusing." Well, it had never occurred to me there was any difference to explain. In fact, at that age, I had never given the matter any thought. Things that you learn in school, I had never been exposed to. And I was wishing that the earth would open up and swallow me whole. Well, thankfully, Sir Ronald and Franklin returned at that moment, and of course, Franklin was able to answer the question. He explained, and I listened, that in most of the world, the word state means a country. We speak of a head of state, be it a monarch or a a king or queen, a dictator, a president, even the president's own cabinet. These are the advisors he gathers around him to help make good decisions. He has one named Secretary of State that's been there from the very beginning when Thomas Jefferson served as our first Secretary of State. That has to do nothing with our 48 states, but how our country deals with other states, other nations. And as James Madison explained just a little while ago, we wanted, at first, we had these states that we united into a country, but they were operating like little countries on their own. And, well, then why do you need a federal government, a national government? Well, Franklin was explaining that wouldn't it be difficult if we had to change our money every time we crossed the border from Massachusetts into Connecticut or up into New Hampshire? If you needed to change your money, you want one set of money for all of these United States. Or if someone threatens us, as Britain did in 1812, we want one army for the country, for all of the United States. Or if, when you needed to send a letter to someone, if you had to put extra postage on it simply because it went across the state border. So the post office is something that we do nationally. Whereas for the state, your state of Massachusetts here, it makes sure that the milk that you're drinking is safe. It makes sure that you'll stay in school long enough, and that when you graduate from school, that you'll have the skills to work. It makes sure that the doctor that you go to or the dentist you go to has gone to school long enough and has learned enough. It makes sure that if you drive a vehicle, you have the proper training. So these are things that our state government still takes care of, and we need them both. Well, I was listening to every word Franklin said, and I registered a vow that once safely back in the United States, I should become a student of my own government, and I have been studying my own government ever since. Well, since that dreadful year of 1924, I can say that women have come a long way. Both in simple things, such as 50 years ago, a young woman would not, in 1900, a woman would not have had an apartment alone if she were single. And now we don't bat an eye at a woman's right to have her own home if she's on her own. We have politicians that are interested. They're asking, what would the women think? It used to be no one would ask that when I was young. Now they want to know, what do the women think? Because they realize they need their votes as well. I've seen women, successful women, as doctors, psychiatrists, lawyers, artists, and musicians. So there are many things that were not even permitted women to think about, that now women can think of as their own careers. And women have entered into prominent positions. We've had a Secretary of State under my husband's administration, Frances Perkins, and Judge Florence Allen, who was on the Supreme Court in Ohio, became a federal judge in the 6th District Court. So even prominent positions. We have 10 women in Congress, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats. 1 is in the Senate and 9 are in the House of Representatives. So this is only a beginning, but people are making a difference. Now, I brought with me a document that reaches beyond the United States, because I think it's very important who all of us are, men and women, as world citizens. Because I think one thing stands out in the 30 years that women have had the vote, the one shift that I see overall, is that the government has greater cognizance of humanitarian questions, things that make people happy, such as enough food, housing, education. Oh, a Department of Education, that's something else we wanted on our platform in 1924, the women did. But security. For example, we first passed the minimum wage in 1938, an hourly wage. Though the Child Labor Amendment wasn't ratified, the Fair Labor and Standards Act of 1938 essentially covered the same questions. And Social Security that was passed in 1935, with the first checks being distributed in 1940. But there's still work to do. During the war, some investigation pointed out that women, on average, were being paid only 2/3 as much as men in the same positions. And so the War Labor Board passed an ordinance saying that for all government contracts, women must be given equal pay for equal work. Now, there's always the enforcement of this, which takes extra work, and it is my hope that industry will follow suit. But I expect this will only really happen if attention stays on this question over the years. There's one change that I would like to see. You will see that on our women's platform, this wasn't just things for women. This was things for people. A Department of Education, fair wages for cost of living and health expenses. These are things for all that the women are fighting for. Well, there's one that I would like us all to fight for, men and women. There can be no real democracy when 15 million of our citizens are denied the right to vote. And I'm not talking about women. We will have no real unity in this country unless we can overcome our prejudices. And in much of the country, the Negro is not allowed to vote. Negro men were supposed to be able to vote since after the Civil War. But certain things are put into place. Perhaps, have you ever heard of a grandfather clause? That's when, someone might be exempted from a rule. Well, that came about because in certain places of the country that did not want the Negro voting, they put in a clause saying that, well, if your grandfather voted, then, and your father, well, then that establishes you in the community. And we know that you have the right to vote too. That was their excuse. But if your grandfather was a slave, then he can't possibly have voted. And often they'll put into place something called a poll tax, something you have to pay in order to vote. But perhaps if your grandfather voted, then you don't have to pay the poll tax. Well, this tends to be unfair both to the poor as well as to the Negro. And it's been most egregious to those of a particular race in our country. It's not only them. The fine photographer Dorothea Lange, during our Great Depression, she went around and took pictures around the country of all different kinds of people. And I remember one photograph she brought back, because she wouldn't just snap their picture and drive away. She would spend about a half hour listening to them and then write down their stories. One of these photographs shows 5 men, all in cowboy hats, standing in front of a barn. And they happened to be white. And in the story she wrote about them, they were all out of work. And they were out of work because their jobs had been lost due to mechanization, machinery, farm machinery that had come into play. Well, they couldn't pay a poll tax, so they couldn't vote on the way things should be run because they were out of work. And to simply strip away the right to vote when someone, through no fault of their own, these were strong men and they were willing to work hard, that seems very unfair. And one of the things she wrote down is, we'd like to whoop someone, but who are we going to whoop? I think we should do more in our country to make sure that everyone has a chance to vote. Not create a literacy test to prevent them, but to teach them how to read and write. Teach everyone how to read and write. And get everyone a chance to vote. Men and women, to pass laws and ordinances along these lines. That's what I would like to see in our future. A book comes to mind that I read many years ago. Ramsay MacDonald wrote about his wife, who died in 1911. She was ahead of her time in many ways. But what really comes alive in the pages of his book are that she never felt that she could rest in comfort when she saw others suffering. She felt that all the men and women of the world were her brothers and sisters. And it is my hope that perhaps in the future we can be guided not only by the experience and brains, intelligence of the men, but also by the hearts of the women. I feel that this situation where we are denying the vote to some in our country unfairly, that reflects very poorly on the United States, that we are losing power on the world stage because of the way we are perceived. It's brought up often in the General Assembly, especially by our Russian counterparts, and they'll do everything they can to undercut the United States. It happens time and again. They'll read from our newspapers about unfair labor practices or segregation, or whatever's in the paper that day, and asks, you're supposed to be a democracy. Is that a democracy, Mrs. Roosevelt? Now, to counteract this, just as our own Constitution had to be put together by many good minds working hard over several years, this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, took us nearly 3 years to complete. What rights would you like to have, for every human being should have? What do you think? Every human being should be either allowed to or should not have to what? Every human being should be paid equally. And first of all, there's an article here that describes who everyone is. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or any other status. So if you think of something else to add to the list, it's enclosed in that last item. But there is another article that speaks about fair pay and that men and women should be treated equally. Any other rights you most would like to see? Do you know that in our Declaration of Independence we have the words, all men are created equal? And there are those who felt that was only talking about men. And there are those who said, well, all men, that was talking about all humans. And at the time, there were those who said that was all white humans or white men. In fact, it was white men who owned property outright. If you were a white man and you did not own property, or you had a mortgage on your property, then you were not a freeholding man and you were not allowed to vote, way back at the beginning. So progress has been made throughout our history to bring the vote to more people. But when they proposed for Article 1 to say, all men are free and equal in dignity and rights, then there were some women on the delegation who said, all men? Oh no, you're not going to say all men. If in some of our countries, Hensa Mehta of India was very adamant about this. She said, in some of our countries, we're just now beginning to gain a little respect and recognition. If we say all men in this document, when we get home, it will be all men. So we debated greatly, and finally, we chose the words, all human beings. Well, in fact, the original was all men are created equal, and some people didn't like that word created, because there were some people sitting around the table who wanted this expressed in a way they could think about it. And some believed in I happen to believe there is a divine creator and a divine spark in each of us. But there were others sitting around the table who weren't so sure, and they wanted this expressed in a way they could believe in it. And so finally, we chose the word, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So you can see there was a great deal of language here that we had to go word by word. Not only that, it had to not only be written in English, but there are 5 official languages of the United Nations, and it had to mean the same thing in each one of them. Well, I encourage, just as every one of us should be familiar with our own Constitution, I really would like everyone in the United States especially, but certainly around the world, to familiarize yourself with this document. You can come and read it in whatever language you like. And it's been translated into many more. I would like to know if you have any questions for me while I have a few minutes left. What might you like to know? Yes. Pardon me? Is it hard to travel? You've perhaps seen, one year they tabulated how many miles, and I traveled some 20,000 miles in 1 year back during my husband's administration. Most of that was on the train, but some of it was in the plane. I like traveling on the plane because it's much faster. I think we should all realize that the plane is a safe way for us to travel. I think that's going to be a way many of us travel in the future. What I do when I'm on the train or the plane is I spend time either reading or mostly writing my Day article. I have a piece that appears in the newspaper 5 days a week. No, 6 days a week, 6 days a week that talks about my day and some of my opinions. So I can get some of my homework done, if you will, while I'm traveling. Yes? Did I support American entrance into World War II? I remember the day I was at the White House that Sunday morning, and there was all this hustle and bustle, and I knew something big had happened. Now the war had been going on for 2 years already, and there was great anticipation that we might be drawn into it as well. My husband tried to prepare the country for this. He was known as his quarantine speech, saying that when someone's very ill, you want to keep them from infecting others. And he saw Hitler as infecting Europe and wanting to contain this disease. But there was so much isolationism in the United States at the time that there was even talk of impeachment, that he should be impeached for having suggested that we might want to be involved at all. It was a very touchy subject. But when Pearl Harbor was bombed, then I gave a speech the next day on the radio. What I was most afraid of immediately was that there would be reaction against our own Japanese citizens. That yes, Japan was our enemy, but I was worried for the US citizens, for the people living in the United States. But no, I did not oppose entry into the war at all. I think it was our duty to help protect our own future as well as help our allies. But it was, I think there were some mistakes made along the way. Yes? What was my main focus during my husband's administration? Well, during the first years, you will remember we were under a great economic duress. So many people were unemployed. And many that had any job at all were underemployed, meaning they weren't earning enough to pay the rent and buy food, the barest essentials for their family. In his first inauguration, my husband said that 1/3 of the country is ill-housed, ill-fed, and ill-clothed. And so a great deal of what I did at the first was to just travel around the country and bring news back to my husband. And many other people did the same. I'm not the only one. I wanted to make sure that when there was a CCC, then also there would be a program for young women. The CCC was for young men. Or if there was a housing project, then, well, is it only for whites, or can we make this for other races also? So I think I was trying to make things as fair as possible. I still want to be useful. Once the war started, I tried to stay out of the way because I didn't want to know anything that might jeopardize our national security by leaking information that I shouldn't. But I've found another way to be useful now at the United Nations. Thank you, one and all. Thank you. I believe that there will soon be more opportunity to ask questions of President Adams and of President Madison, and I perhaps will also be available for additional questions as well. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yeah, take it.